In a world full of noise, where headlines fade faster than truth, there's a signal steady, unshaken. Look deeper, ask more. Listen closer.
What populism does is it divides all of society into the people and the elite. You know, one of the things, it's very devious, but one of the things that Russia has spent a lot of time doing is trying to know and understand our societies. So they put a lot of time into propping up certain political parties that would help them along the way to vote in a certain way. Like, okay, some people still have worries about immigration or inequality. Well, has Europe relied too heavily on the United States? I think you can say yes and you can say no. European countries came together and said, the US wants us to do more. Okay, we're going to do more.
Listen closer.
I would like to underline that we do appreciate all support that we received and continue to receive during this 5th year of Russian war against us. And of course, the contribution of our Baltic colleagues are rather huge, because our Baltic colleagues, they definitely supported us during the first wave of aggression since 2014 and continue to support us during the Great War. I would like to switch to the recent political changes within the European countries. Again, Ukrainians highly appreciated all support that we continue to feel despite, some political changes in some political, in some countries. So I would like to ask about the movements, I would say in diplomatic way, because a lot of experts among Ukrainian analysts, as well as our European colleagues, they pay attention to some anti-establishment movements. Some of them are called as populists, but nevertheless, why we observe such a change in the political skin of some European countries, and how, according to your personal perception, how could that affect support for Ukraine or for NATO unity? And a tricky question from my point of view.
Okay.
Do you think we are witnessing a crisis of so-called concept of liberal democracy, or we are witnessing simply a transformation of it?
Great question. And in a previous academic life, this is something that I actually studied and wrote about. Why did it happen? I think that it started to happen. I think that there was a very peculiar picture. This is the one aspect where I can tie populism to security and international relations. Actually, there was just a period of time where some countries in the West, the wealthier ones, the more prosperous ones, certainly the safer ones, they just most people had life so good that they could start really focusing on post-materialist values rather than materialist values. So if you're not facing the possibility of war or famine or aggression, you can start to worry about other things. Now, that doesn't mean that those other things are necessarily bad, but I think that there was this whole idea of migration, globalization, people and goods and money could cross borders relatively easily, and that shifted the party systems in Europe and at the countries that did not face Soviet occupation. Of course, they had older and more robust political systems, and then there was this idea of political correctness and sort of shaping what the Overton window dictates you can and can't say in terms of personal or political reputation. But that all started to change, and it started to change really quickly, because I think that there was a crisis of political parties. A lot of voters felt that mainstream political parties, and I don't like to use that term, but if we talk about parties that political science literature deems to be populist, or it could be on the left or on the right, that the parties in the center, they were not really primarily focused on the average person
Mm,
in the country. Now, what the average person in any country is oftentimes over exaggerated, because the average Swede, the average Icelander, the average Canadian, the average Brit, what is that even? But I think that there was this idea that was infused with class and ethnicity, and that the sort of sociocultural and socioeconomic left and right boundaries are certainly different in the United States than they are in Europe. But I think that there were a lot of people who felt that they had been left behind because of mainstream political parties not managing globalization, migration, inequality, really rapid cultural change, national identity, and that goes part and parcel with the interests of the people. And I think
mhm,
that the rise of social media um, really took off around 2015 or so. And a lot of really good and really informative literature that discusses this with empirical evidence, excuse me, looks at this era where we had the first Donald Trump presidency and Brexit, and right before that, in 2014, there was a European election parliament, and the news headlines ran that it was a populist earthquake. But that
mhm,
earthquake actually happened a little bit afterwards. In that election, it was mostly parties that had always won at the European level, because a lot of citizens didn't vote at the European level. And
yeah,
so Nigel Farage's former party, UKIP, Marine Le Pen's party, and a couple of others, they put a lot of emphasis into the European elections because that's what got them to be household names. And I think that there's some kind of semblance with the Overton window, because if you are in, an echo chamber, a filter bubble or an echo chamber, you can live in Austria and you can communicate with people online in the United Kingdom or Norway who have more in common with you politically because you're into some movement like this than your neighbors. But now that's not even true, because you're seeing, like in Belfast, in Northern Ireland, in the United Kingdom, you're seeing a lot of these protests, and so these street movements and these sort of grassroots movements, eventually politicians will tack onto that, because they can say, hey, look, here's an
mm,
untapped voter base because party X and party Y and party Z, who were the political establishment, didn't speak to those people. We're going to do it now, and voila. And the algorithms, even before X became X, when Twitter was just Twitter, I think the algorithms really fed this type of divisive rhetoric. And that actually does trickle into foreign policy, because I think a lot of it becomes a domestic backlash. Because if you look at, what populism does is it divides all of society into the people and the elite. And
mm,
it's one category or the other. You can't be in both of them. It just doesn't work. And it's a moral distinction. So that's why people like Nigel Farage or Donald Trump or Silvio Berlusconi, people who are wealthy and affluent, can speak to a voter base that largely is not. And this has changed over the past couple of years. So now who belongs to what party and what political identity has changed so much. I mean, I could go on and on for a long time. I won't. I'll try to keep it, to the point here. But then it becomes, well, the elite drive foreign policy. So why are we starting to do this? And what did Donald Trump do in the United States the first time? It was make America great again and America first. So first, what
mm,
happens is they say, well, why are we spending all of this money on other countries? Why are we not spending it to fix our roads? Why are we not spending it to fix our education system? And that is a really, it's so much of a tight rope to walk that it becomes no longer a tightrope. It becomes something that um, damages something else that's important, that is not really explained to people why it's important. So if you get people in, towns or cities or wherever who are left behind, of course, you know, issues like education and access to education should be fixed and all of that. But it doesn't mean that it needs to come at the expense of a world order that was not perfect, but certainly was able to, as long as it was able to, prevent this type of destruction. And one of the things, it's very devious, but one of the things that Russia has spent a lot of time doing is trying to know and understand our societies. And I hate to say that they do anything well, but they do that well because it's a phase zero operation, and they view themselves, if not at war with the West, they're in a conflict with the West because our values means that that's in the way of them getting, if not the world, the Europe that they want. So they put a lot of time into propping up certain political parties that would help them along the way to vote in a certain way that would hinder a really just and robust response to them trying to meddle in our security architecture. I would say that from the Ukrainian perspective, or when it pertains to Ukraine, they really tried with certain politicians and political parties to try and get at this for monetary support, for sending weapons, for even patience and moral clarity. They tried, but I think they failed, not across the board, because a lot of these parties that would be called populist radical right parties, not all of them, but a fair amount of them used to be supportive of Russia. Some of them still are, but across the board, it's mostly seen as something that you don't want to do because it's morally repugnant. So, for example, Marine Le Pen's national rally, it may very well be that her successor, Jordan Bardella, runs for president if she runs into certain legal issues. And he has really walked that down. Why? Because he understands not a good look. But it's not true across the board. But I would say it's true enough to not put that in a plus column for Russia. So at least that's something. And you ask about liberal democracy. I wouldn't say that it's collapsing. It's certainly under stress and under some kind of transformation. I actually think that everything will come out more positive right now, because I think it's hard to say the vast majority of voters without a really thorough empirical, backing up of evidence. But I think that if I look at a couple of elections in Estonia and in Lithuania recently, I think a lot of people have chosen, enough people have chosen stability after COVID, after Russia's second phase of their war of aggression against Ukraine, that it's like, okay, some people still have worries about immigration or inequality, but I think if you are close enough to raise alarm bells to that particular country, stability is going to be more important. And I think we'll have to see. There are a couple of key elections coming up, but Hungary was another one that happened not so long ago. That changed. We'll see what happens in the United States, first with the midterms and then with the next presidential election. But
I hope we will talk about these elections after. Yeah. And I kindly ask you to save the date, I would say, and to save the spot for this conversation. But I would like to back to the issue of transatlantic unity and community. I still believe in our horizontal connections. And of course, the key issue is about the participation of our American partners in these lines. So has Europe relied too much on the United States for security? And can Europe become strategically independent? I know that there are a huge shift in our European mindset, because we all think about strategic autonomy. And if another major conflict emerged tomorrow, is Europe as one community actually prepared economically, politically, military, of course, for a prolonged war? I would kindly ask, to elaborate a little bit on the recent news devoted to the possible attack on NATO countries. But nevertheless, let's think in terms of strategic planning, whether Europe is actually prepared for the prolonged war.
Hmm. Well, has Europe relied too heavily on the United States? I think you can say yes and you can say no. If you look at when NATO was founded, how that story unfolded, um, and the role of the United States back when it was founded, there was at the time the U.S. said, okay, we cannot let the Soviet Union take over Europe. So we're going to have to commit to certain things in order to make sure that they're not lost. And that commitment, of course, evolved. We met at the 75th anniversary summit in Washington, and I mean there was still some hope where the U.S. was going. But I think even before Trump came, certain U.S. administrations were thinking, well, we're a global actor because we're, the unipolar actor in the world. Whether or not that's true now, but it was at the time. Several presidential administrations have said, okay, well, Europe needs to do more. They need to start thinking about their security more. We're not going to leave them cold turkey, but we're going to ask them to do more. And some countries did, and some countries didn't. One of the things that I think is misarticulated right now is talking about NATO members not paying their fair share. Does that mean Poland? Certainly not. You can't say that. Does it mean Latvia and Estonia and Lithuania? Certainly not. You can't say that. It just means some members, but not all. Well, that's changed. And there was a period of time fairly recently where some member states did not meet the commitment that they pledged to do in 2014. But I think I would hesitate to say that they have relied too heavily on the United States because, of course, the U.S. had the nuclear deterrent, and that wasn't a European issue. That was an American issue because I don't know about this administration, but previous administrations understood that they did not want to have anyone else become nuclear armed. So a political trade-off would be we leave the deterrent in, and then nobody else in Europe is going to say, "Hey, let's get a nuclear weapon." Okay, so we keep things relatively calm. Um, but in addition to the nuclear deterrence, there's the strategic lift that the U.S. provides. There's intelligence. There's missile defense. There's C2. There's a lot of high-end military capabilities that Europe can't replace so easily, but they can do it. So could Europe become strategically independent? Well, I would say that that's a really tricky fine line to walk because if we're talking about without the nuclear deterrent, okay, France and the UK, they possess certain capabilities, but it's not the same as the US. That's probably best case scenario to really serve as the final line of deterrence against aggression, which when it comes to Europe can only really come from one place. But I don't think they can become fully independent soon, but they can become very strategically responsible. And I think that that's what they've done in a very short window of time. European countries came together and said, the US wants us to do more. Okay, we're going to do more. We need to do it like yesterday, but yesterday's past. So we're going to continue on a path to make sure that security and defense is a fundamental concern for everyone. That is not something that certain political parties view as feasible or as actionable or as desirable, whereas other political parties don't. We need to have that across the board so whoever wins elections can really be prepared to defend either a specific country or if they're further removed from Russia, countries that are in the alliance that will potentially need that in the future. So I think that there's an interesting question that you ask about, is Europe prepared for a prolonged conflict? I think that Europe is very, very awake politically and strategically to this than they were in 2021. I would say that right now, today, this, June 15th, 2026, not fully. But my answer to your question would be yes, because that understanding is there that this needs to happen. And I think best case scenario, the US says, all right, you're doing your thing. We're really happy with how quickly and how seriously um, you Europeans are taking this. So we're still going to be in, but you've got to do more, and we can sort of make the burden sharing more even, and we can have political discussions. I think where it's starting to get a bit tricky is the way in which this is articulated and conveyed. And I'd like to talk about that for a moment, because the President of the United States has a very specific way of communicating. But there are people, two in particular, that I'd like to highlight. The first is the U.S. Perm Rep to NATO, Ambassador Matthew Whitaker, and the second is the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. Those two people, if you listen to their interviews, if you see them at conferences, they have only positive things to say about NATO. It's very, very alliance reassuring to everyone. And they constantly will tell the audience that the US is there for Europe. We just want more to be done, but we are here. And I think that's a very important thing to discuss when we talk about the future of NATO and the future of the US in NATO. And I like to, when I give lectures to students or at conferences, use the analogy of a scale. You know, when NATO enlarged, the U.S. was definitely here politically, but now the political balance is shifting. It's here, and it's here because Europe understands multilateralism, and they understand that we have to reinforce values, and that the political aspect, the values-based aspect, and the military aspect all form a synergy about what the alliance is, what it actually is as an entity. And I said, you know, where is the power of NATO geographically? It's in 32 different capitals, because 32 nations have agreed that they are in this, and they want to work for the safety and security of their citizens and their territory. And I'd also like to stress the aspect that certainly not all, but the vast majority of congressmen and women and senators in the US are very pro-NATO. And that was one thing that a lot of them spoke out against the current administration, when there was talk of troop reductions in Romania, when there was a chatter about if the Supreme Allied Commander Europe would be given over to a non-American four-star. And there was a lot of support in Washington that I don't think will change. And of course, elections can change certain things, but if you look at it at the end of the day, right now, as of today, the Trump administration has not, they have not inflicted any massive change on the alliance. They've said, we want to focus on the Indo-Pacific. And then they wanted to focus on Iran and the Middle East, but the message has always been this has to be not just the backbone of the U.S. And I think that's also the only reason that's new for NATO is because when NATO started, because of the position of the U.S. and the position of European allies at the time, it was what it was. Those things naturally evolve. Those things change. And it couldn't have gone on forever like this. So I think a really good NATO is where Canada and Europe have a political voice, and it's more of a discussion than one country dictating terms to. So the last thing I'll say is that I also think that there's enough of a deterrent that, and of course, from a military perspective, you know, you pray for peace and you prepare for war. So even if there are no intel warning signs that it's going to happen in a year, we have to prepare enough to make sure that we have the upper edge on technology, which is why the newest rounds of EU sanctions towards Russia are very, very important, and that we have a lot of common multilateral discussions to talk about how rapidly changing the security environment is, and especially the role of technology in that. And when we talk about technology, who to learn better about the war of the 21st century than the Ukrainians? Who to learn better about drones than the Ukrainians? And so I think it's really good that European leaders have invited President Zelensky to be a part of that discussion. because we're all, and that's the whole purpose of NATO. We are stronger because we're together. So I think unilateralism is not going to work out, but I don't think that's a bad thing. I'm a very big proponent of multilateralism, and that I think is NATO's future.
Well, Luis, I think that we can talk for ages because I have a couple of questions, additional questions, but nevertheless, let's leave them for other conversations. And it was very fascinating. I hope it would be very fascinating and thoughtful for our audience. Thank you for joining me. Thank you for contributing to this very important conversation. And I think we will meet each other somewhere in Europe or in the United States, whatever. Thank you once more for joining us.
That's my pleasure. Slava Ukraina.
Heroям Slava, thank you so much. And if you, our distinguished audience, enjoy this conversation, make sure to subscribe, leave a comment or two, and share this episode with your network. From me, from my team, thank you for watching us. Thank you for watching our Transatlantic Compass series, and I'll see you during the next episode. I hope so. Thank you so much and have a nice day.